The majority of the Indian economy is dependent on services. And over the last few years, this trend has only gotten stronger. With the following notable exception: drugs. As of 2020, India's pharmaceutical sector ranked 11th in terms of value and 3rd in terms of volume. And it is expanding very quickly. India is the top exporter of generic medications in the world. 40% of the generic medicines used in the United States come from India. They exported drugs worth $16 billion more than they imported in 2020. The high criteria and laws of numerous nations throughout the world are met by these shipments. The pharmaceutical sector in India is respectable. It's an amazing tale how this industry came to be. In this video, we examine how the Indian pharmaceutical sector began as little more than a set of copycats and later developed along the value chain to become a leader on a worldwide scale. With India's independence in 1947, its journey officially begins. Millions of Indians lacked access to basic medications at this time. The drug trade in the nation was almost entirely dominated by foreigners. 8 of the top 10 companies, accounting for 90% of the market, were multinationals from the West, primarily from the UK, France, and Germany. Instead of really developing their own pharmaceuticals, domestic Indian companies devoted the majority of their efforts to marketing and distribution of others' products. Indians had to import practically all of the medications they used. Due to the fact that 99% of pharmaceuticals in the country were covered by patents, domestic drug prices were among the highest in the world. As a result, only those with means could use medicines. It is obvious that this scenario is unsustainable. And the Indian government has made several attempts to address this excessive reliance on medicine imports from abroad. Hindustan Antibiotics Limited is a public sector pharmaceutical company that was founded by the government in 1954. A few years later, they partnered with the Soviets to form a second one, this time called Indian Drugs and Pharmaceuticals Limited. Then, in the 1960s, ICI Pharmaceuticals, a British pharmaceutical company, created the high blood pressure drug propranolol. This beta blocker aids in reducing anxiety and shields the body against migraines. It was too pricey to use the medication in India. For the Indian market, a generic version of the medication was first produced by the Cipla firm in India. ICI complained about this to the Indian government. Yusuf Hamid, the chief of R&D of Cipla, explained his conduct to Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India at the time. Gandhi agreed with the argument's validity and encouraged Parliament to change the regulations governing medication patents. This resulted in the Patent Act of 1970 being passed, which began the revival of the Indian pharmaceutical sector. The 1970 Patent Act had 2 objectives. The first was to ensure affordable access to medications. The second objective was to promote the growth of a domestic pharmaceutical sector in India and promote import substitution. You can see how this new structure gave the Indian pharmaceutical business a huge new opportunity. Every popular medicine import could now be reverse engineered for the Indian market. Between 1970 and 1980, the number of companies in India's pharmaceutical business more than doubled. At this early period, domestic Indian enterprises mainly reverse-engineered already existing medications. They examined the sequential stages involved in producing the medication and made small adjustments. By the end of the 1980s, Indian pharmaceutical companies were able to produce almost any novel compound without having access to the exclusive recipes of the original innovator company. Over the years, there was less time between the debut of the original innovation and that of the Indian generic. And this illustrated the growing ability of domestic companies to reverse engineer. Ibuprofen is an illustration. The global release of ibuprofen occurred in 1967. In 1973, 6 years later, India produced its first generic. Bayer released the antibiotic ciprofloxacin into the global market in 1986. In just 3 years, domestic Indian companies developed a generic version of ciprofloxacin, slashing the waiting period in half. 95% of the nation's medications were supplied by Indian businesses by 2006. It had been successful to substitute imported goods. However, the 1970 patent modification had significant disadvantages, just like every policy. One aspect was that it produced a large but undervalued Indian pharmaceutical sector. A drug company has simple admission requirements and requires little funding to get started. Around 16,000 pharmaceutical businesses operated in the market in 1990. The businesses that persisted concentrated on producing as many molecules as they could at the lowest cost. Due to the fact that producing at a large scale would be necessary in order to turn a profit, this led to extremely low margins and significant overcapacity. Up to 100 brands were present for a single chemical, which led to a severe fragmentation of the market. The industry had gotten to the point where there were too many little companies and not enough money for everyone. The local Indian pharmaceutical industry did not invest significantly in R&D and did not create many new pharmaceuticals because it lacked funding, incentives, and protections. Some businesses started selling overseas. About 40% of Indian medication output was intended for export by the 1990s. Despite the fact that most of these were of little worth, this would appear to be a success. Indian businesses couldn't access more lucrative markets. The Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS, was ratified by India in 1992. This would mark a significant turning point in the development of the Indian pharmaceutical industry and would be beneficial for promoting homegrown innovation. The Indian government was forced to change its previous patent rules in order to be more in line with global trade norms. Now, among other things, the government will acknowledge product patents and provide new products exclusive marketing rights. This agreement signing had been highly contentious. Two factions of the domestic sector emerged, one supporting and the other opposing tougher IP protections. There were some strong arguments presented by the opponents. For instance, the Indian people have previously suffered from a lack of knowledge transfers and from strong IP rights. But in the end, the first group prevailed, helped by a change in the rules. India was given until 2005 by the international trade community to set up its drug business. As a result, the administration began progressively making the required adjustments. The industry underwent a significant transformation between 1992 and 2005, moving away from the factors that had made it so successful for decades and toward a new, more lucrative model. Different strategies were used by the Indian industry to adjust to these advancing developments. A few companies made the decision to invest in R&D, move up the value chain, and go into the drug development industry. The Indian pharmaceutical industry only identified and created 13 novel medicinal molecules between 1956 and 1987. That quantity was 7 between 1991 and 2005. The industry's R&D expenditure increased by just 4.9% yearly prior to 1992. That increased to 6.6%. Several Indian businesses began adding compounds to the pipeline for medication research. The number of pharmaceutical medication patents held by Indian institutes increased from 9 from 1990 to 1994 to 48 from 1995 to 1998. In the years that followed, from 1999 to 2002, that number increased even further to 227. Through a number of programs, the government promoted this R&D expenditure. They established a number of governmental organizations in 1995 to coordinate the academic and business sectors. The majority of Indian pharmaceutical companies accurately believed that it was beyond their reach, especially before 2005. It costs money and takes time to find new drugs. Even though multinationals in the West have been doing it for a long time, they still find it challenging. It would be absurd to expect many Indian businesses the majority of which are small or medium-sized, to immediately compete with this. Few people have the means to do so. Smaller businesses still allocated 1% or less of their revenue on R&D as of 2005. Many of them have sought alternative methods of boosting or diversifying their income. The generics market in India is currently quite competitive on a global scale. Aided by both its cheaper expenses and the knowledge gained by competing in the fierce home market. The U.S.'s passage of the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984, which made it easier for the FDA to approve generic pharmaceuticals, contributed to a favorable regulatory climate for generic drugs. The Indian pharmaceutical industry's concurrent reliance on China for its active ingredients is a worrying issue with this export success. These are the most crucial ingredients in the creation of the completed medicine. Acetaminophen, for instance, is the active component in Tylenol. India gets 70% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. Since 2005, imports of Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients, particularly antibiotics, have increased. When the Chinese entered the market in the 1990s with goods that were 40% less expensive than what India could produce, it lost its domestic market share. Even now, with Chinese labor prices greater than they were back then, there is still a 20% pricing difference. Due to China's economic lockdown in 2020, this industrial deficit became very apparent. Chinese suppliers ran out of supplies to send to India and put export restrictions on some of the chemicals used to make viral medications. In addition, there are actual geopolitical conflicts between China and India. Therefore, the Indian sector should collaborate with the government to implement new import substitution rules for these active components in order to address those limitations. India's success in the pharmaceutical industry is well known. Other nations observed how the 1970 Indian Patent Act reduced drug costs and freed the domestic market from the grip of multinational corporations. Ironically, other nations began moving toward process-based patents at the same time as the Indians were doing the opposite. Without the cancellation and reapplication of these IP rights, the Indian pharmaceutical sector would not be where it is now. It is the epitome of a market-driven transformation brought on by environmental change. I also respect the fact that they changed things based on what they thought was best for them rather than adhering to an outdated philosophy. Even if there are still certain obstacles to be resolved moving forward, India's pharmaceutical industry will play a significant part in addressing global health problems. Please feel free to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you like the content on this channel.